Welcome, child development students. Today we're going to be covering Chapter 2 of our text, which is Federal Legislation, Early Intervention, and Prevention. And who is this little cutie pie right here? This is my son Coco when he was probably about 18 months in an early intervention program, an amazing early intervention program called the UCLA Early Intervention Program. So in this chapter, we're going to be discussing early intervention and ways to prevent challenges that children may face and how legislation ties into that. So as we discussed in Chapter 1, my recommendation to all of you is when you begin a chapter, you start with the objectives first. Take the time before diving into reading the text, stop on the first page, read the objectives first, see what you already know about the information and the objectives. That way you're activating your prior knowledge, you're building your schema. Those are what I call the coat hooks in your brain. And as you go through the chapter, you learn more information, you elaborate on these topics, you are adding a coat, a scarf, a belt, a jacket, a hat to those coat hooks, which is your prior knowledge. And so you're elaborating, you're building on to your existing schema. And this is going to help you. This is all part of information processing theory. This is going to help you move that information that you're learning from your short-term memory where, you read it and then the next day you have no idea, you don't remember anything that you read. Definitely not when you have a learning celebration or any sort of assessment, you don't remember what you read. So by going through this process of reading the objectives first and comparing what you thought you knew to what you're learning, you are going to help move that information from your short-term memory into your working and long-term memory. And that's when you actually learn something. So learning means that it's information that you've retained. And that's our goal. All right, so objective number 1, we have several for this chapter. Objective number 1, after reading this chapter, you should be able to discuss how the early intervention and civil rights movement set the stage for current legislation and individuals with disabilities. 2, explain the impact of landmark legislation for people with disabilities. 3, identify the components of No Child Left Behind, or NCLB 2001, including recent changes made. 4, highlight the landmark case law for the inclusion of all children. 5, provide an overview of public policy and gifted children. And finally, describe 3 pieces of legislation designed to prevent developmental disabilities in children. So again, take some time, think about what you already know or think you know, might have heard about these topics. I'm going to give you a moment to pause and reflect and think about it. All right, so let's go ahead and dive in. The early intervention movement, environment and experience. So this is the belief that children are what they are has been challenged. Environment and experiences greatly affect how a child grows and develops. So it's not just however they're born, that's how they're going to stay, right? It's all about what experiences they have in their environment that affect how they grow and develop. Brain research leads us to understand that children need experiences often and early to develop the needed synapses. Those are those connections, those little explosions in the brain where you're developing neural pathways. So that's important to keep in mind as well. Civil rights. People with disabilities have the same rights as everyone else. I will repeat. People with disabilities have the same rights as everyone else. And thankfully, we have legislation to support this. And that was not always the case, as we learned in Chapter 1. They have a right to a free, appropriate, and equal education. Landmark legislation passed and is continuing to pass, exercising the constitutional rights of all individuals. All right, so landmark legislation and people with disabilities, we first have university-affiliated facilities, that's PL 88-164, and their main purpose are the following: to create, demonstrate, and evaluate intervention and educational programs for children and youth with disabilities and their families, to provide professional trainees with interdisciplinary training, to conduct research related to human development and developmental delays, to establish university-community partnerships to improve services for people with disabilities. We also have the Handicapped Children's Early Education Assistance Act. The major purpose of this legislation is to improve early intervention services for children with disabilities, children who are at risk for disabilities, and their families. Federal funds supported experimental centers known as the First Chance Network and model demonstration projects. We also have the Head Start Act, required that 10% of Head Start's enrollment be reserved for children with developmental disabilities. Head Start continues to grow. In 2007, Head Start was serving over 900,000 children. More than 12% of those children have disabilities. Then we have the Developmental Disabilities Act. Section 504 focused on reducing discrimination against individuals with disabilities. The law required that everyone with a disability be given access to jobs, education, housing, and public buildings. This law also required schools to make accommodations for children who have disabilities but do not qualify for special education. So this is helpful for that population who may not have an official diagnosis but who still need accommodations to be successful. Then we have the Education of All Handicapped Children Act, which has now been renamed to exemplify person-first language, which we will learn about as well. So it's now called the Individuals with Disabilities Education Improvement Act, or we call it IDEA. Reflects person-first terminology, guarantees all children a free, appropriate public education, and encourages states to locate and serve preschool children needing early intervention services. IDEA mandates zero reject. In other words, local school systems must provide all children, regardless of the severity of their disability, with a free education appropriate to each child's needs. And you might hear the abbreviation FAPE, F-A-P-E, and that's free, appropriate public education. Another right for people with special needs that is supported with legislation. There's also non-discriminatory evaluation. Tests must be appropriate to the child's language and cultural background to avoid that cultural bias. Assessment is to be based on several types of evaluation, so not just one measure, and is to include cognitive, adaptive, and social performance. And this is all mandated under the Individuals with Disabilities Educational Improvement Act, IDEA. It also mandates appropriate education. Local school districts must provide educational services that are appropriate to each individual child. So I've heard this saying, if you know one child with autism, you know one child with autism. So the irony of that statement is that rather than a blanket statement, which is what you probably would expect a statement like that begins like that, it's that if you know one child with autism, that those characteristics apply to that one child. We don't want to generalize and create a blanket idea that all children with autism have these characteristics or behave this way, because there might be a lot of nuances and distinctions from child to child. And that goes for many other diagnoses as well. Least restrictive environment. Inclusion is part of that. This is where children with disabilities must be educated alongside students. I'm going to add, to the extent possible, and this is an important piece to add, to the extent possible, with students who do not have identified disabilities. And I say to the extent possible, I'm going back to chapter 1 where I said there are some cases, like with my son Colson, where I wanted him in a more restrictive environment because I felt, because of the severity of his needs, he needed to be in a situation where the classes were smaller, there was highly trained staff, and that there were other children who had similar needs as him, that he needed to see, he needed to feel like he was part of a community, and I wanted him to be around children who were similar to him. So in that sense, it was to the extent possible, he was in a classroom alongside students who do not have identified disabilities. So in some cases for children, it might not be possible for them to be in a situation, but you want it to be as least restrictive as possible. So I just want to point out, least restrictive environment is not a one size fits all. So least restrictive environment is not always a general education classroom. It depends on the child and their needs and what's best for that child at that time. All right. Just wanted to put that out there because that's very important. I learned from experience. Due process also, I've been there and I know from experience. That is when parents have the right to call a special hearing when they do not agree with the school's educational plans for their child. And this is something that I want to stress for any of you who are advocates who work in schools with children, or if you are a parent of a child with special needs, going into education, you will most likely work with children who have some sort of exceptionality. It's really important to know your rights. I think that a lot of time parents defer to professionals, but you know the child the best. And so I think parents need to know that they have rights to say, hey, I don't agree with this, and my child, you need to explore other options that are going to be most appropriate for my child. So just something that I wanted to put out there too. Also, IDEA mandates parent participation. IDEA stresses the importance of parents' contributions to their child's progress. The role of parents has been strengthened with each reauthorization of IDEA. States must provide mediation to schools and parents if there are disagreements about children's educational services. And I added another picture of Colson. This is when Colson was attending the UCLA Early Intervention Program. And what's unique about that, and according to what our text says here on the slide, is it required a high level of parent participation. So 3 days a week, we were at UCLA for 2 hours, and literally it was just Colson because there were no other kids in the early intervention, the toddler portion at this time. So it was just Colson, the teacher, and myself. And so we would go through the different activities with him 3 days a week for those 2 hours. It was an amazing, amazing program. That goes up to age 3. So when he aged out at age 3, I was so sad, but it was amazing that he was able to experience it for the time that he did. All right, so continuing landmark legislation in people with disabilities, we also have education of the handicapped amendments, services for children from birth to age 3. This part of law is known as discretionary legislation. This means that a state may serve children from birth to 2 years of age if it chooses, but it is not required by law to do so. Okay, so services for children birth to age 3. This is what is called Part B services. Those are called Part C services. Part B is after age 3. Those to be served are infants and toddlers who are experiencing developmental disabilities or at risk of having substantial delays unless they receive early intervention services. So thinking about what are some factors that would make a child at risk for having substantial delays? So that could be that maybe they have a sibling who has a diagnosis, maybe they were premature, maybe there are other socioeconomic or environmental factors that would put them at risk. So those would be things to be considered. Labeling is no longer required. Each infant, toddler, and family receive a multidisciplinary written assessment of his or her needs and of the services prescribed. Then, an individualized service plan, or IFSP, is developed to address the needs identified by the team, including the family. Then we have services for children ages 3 to 5. Services for children beginning at age 3 are not discretionary. States receiving federal funds for early intervention programs must serve young children with developmental disabilities according to the same formula and requirements as before. So what are the latest updates on IDEIA? The new definition requires special education teachers hold at least a BA, bachelor's degree, obtain full state special education licensure or equivalent, and cannot hold a temporary or emergency licensure. Also, extensive provisions are aimed at ensuring special education and related services for children with disabilities who are homeless or otherwise members of highly mobile populations. All right, so what are some changes in procedural safeguards? The addition of resolution session prior to a due process hearing to encourage the parties resolve their dispute within 15 days of the parent's complaint. Functional behavioral assessment. children with disabilities who have been expelled from school still have the right to an education, and the state must guarantee that services are still provided throughout the expulsion. We also have the authority to extend Part C services for infants and toddler services beyond the age of 2 years. And we also have short-term objectives and benchmarks are no longer required sections in the IEP. So, discipline issues, something else to consider. A student with a disability generally cannot be suspended from school for more than 10 school days if the misconduct was related to his or her disability and services still need to be provided. So this is good law to know. The IEP team, including parents, must conduct a functional behavior assessment and consider strategies including positive behavioral support strategies to facilitate appropriate behavior in the classroom. So think about how children with disabilities that may manifest themselves in different behaviors and how those students will probably be disproportionately suspended or expelled from school. And so this is a kind of a safeguard put in place to try to minimize that. We have the American with Disabilities Act. ADA gives civil rights protection to individuals in private employment, all public services and accommodations, transportation, and telecommunications. Some of the most significant implications are in the areas of access to childcare and community recreation programs. Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act says, this is the first civil rights statute for persons with disabilities, protects qualified individuals from discrimination based on disability. Employers and organizations receiving federal funds cannot exclude or deny individuals with disabilities an equal opportunity to receive program benefits and services. No Child Left Behind. So this was established under the Bush administration to improve reading and math testing in the public schools and reauthorize education reform using federal funds. This mandate requires states to develop accountability standards to measure annual student progress in reading and math. It also works on literacy development. There are teacher requirements and family initiatives, assessment of children with disabilities. So, children with disabilities or delays in development are to be tested along with children without disabilities beginning in the 3rd grade with only a few exceptions. If a child's IEP calls for accommodations in assessments, these must be offered. What are some concerns about No Child Left Behind? Now that could be a whole course just on concerns and problems with No Child Left Behind. So there are concerns about meeting adequate yearly progress by the deadline. And by 2010, there was a proposed reform of No Child Left Behind, broader range of assessments to evaluate academic skills. So not just narrowing it down, you may have heard the term teaching to the test. And unfortunately, even though maybe there was some validity to the advent of No Child Left Behind, unfortunately, it just led to such high stakes for schools that the methods used to have students pass the test were not always very beneficial for students. And then you have cultural biases that come out, especially for students who are second language learners and students with disabilities who still were required to take these tests. It was definitely not a win for students. Punishments to those schools who did not meet AYP would lessen, and waivers from No Child Left Behind requirements were accepted. So there were some ways to kind of circumvent the threat or the pressure from No Child Left Behind. All right, so inclusion case law, Sacramento Unified School District versus Holland. This was in 1992. The district court ruled that a 9-year-old with Down syndrome must be fully included in a general education classroom and provided a 4-part test that must be used to evaluate the feasibility of inclusion. So if inclusion is feasible, like doable, the 4-part test asks, number 1, what educational benefits are available to the child with disabilities when supplemented by the appropriate supports? 2, what are the non-academic, i.e. social benefits of placement in a general education classroom? 3, what is the cost on non-disabled children? And 4, what is the cost overall? Then we have Alberti versus Board of Education of Clementon School District, 1993. The judge ruled strongly in favor of the child's right to receive inclusive education and said inclusion is a right, not a privilege for a select few. And you can see here I included, this is a photo that was taken from the Napa Center website. My son attends Napa Center for therapies. He also attended their preschool program. And so this is a photo that was on the website with my son and his former preschool teacher. And so again, I put this here because this is an example of the wonderful results of some of the legislation that helps support the needs for children with special rights. Public policy and the gifted. So all 50 states have definitions for giftedness. So how do you define a child who is gifted? Federal funds are not allocated for gifted programs. States have taken it upon themselves to provide services to children who demonstrate giftedness. And just in case you weren't aware, giftedness would be a child that's considered advanced for their age, whether they have heightened critical thinking skills, artistic skills, leadership ability skills, math, reading, etc. So these are the children who are considered to be developing at an exceptional rate and who are dramatically above grade level from their peers. Educators continue to try to identify young gifted children. And I just want to point out that some folks think that if you are a child with a disability or special needs, then you could not be categorized as gifted, and that is not true. There are many children who are both gifted and who are diagnosed with an exceptionality disability. So I just wanted to make that clear, because that's kind of a false assumption that a lot of people hold. So prevention is important. The timing of prevention before conception. So thinking about genetics, if you are of mature maternal age, when you conceive, then most hospitals will require that you have genetic testing, because as we age, we are increasing the likelihood of having a genetic abnormality. Chromosomal mishaps happen, amniocentesis and chorionic villus sampling can be done to assess the unborn child. Timing of prevention, so prevention during pregnancy, so making sure good maternal health, adequate prenatal care, foregoing drugs and alcohol. And so here you can see this is when I was probably about 7 months pregnant with Colson. You see I have my other son Noah, who was probably about 18 months at the time, awaiting the arrival of his baby brother. Also, timing of prevention during and after birth is important, making sure that you have access to appropriate medical services, routine screenings, the APGAR. That is the assessment. You may have learned that or experienced that if you are a parent who's given birth, or Child Development 1 discusses this. This is the rating scale that we use for newborns to make sure that they are safe to go home, that they're able to sustain life outside of the womb. There are also blood tests and routine well baby checkups. Also, prevention of secondary disabilities, which are disabilities that come about because of a primary disability and are secondary disabilities. So, for example, my son has epilepsy, but epilepsy is a secondary disability that is a result of his genetic mutation, which is called IQ-SEC2. So that is his primary disability, and then it causes the secondary disability of the epilepsy. So they can become cumulative deficits if not treated. Preventative measures can be put into place to lessen the effects. Also, prevention and related legislation. Early and periodic screening, diagnosis, and treatment is important. The intent of the law is that low-income children be screened regularly during infancy and the preschool years to prevent and treat health problems that could interfere with development. So the idea being early intervention, early prevention, early screening. If we are able to identify potential issues ahead of time and treat them, then we can provide a better outcome for the child and make sure that they're going to have a higher likelihood of success as they develop and grow. Vaccines for Children's Program. The purpose is to prevent childhood diseases such as rubella, mumps, measles, diphtheria, tetanus, and pertussis or whooping cough. And then we have supplemental food programs for women, infants, and children, otherwise known as WIC. The law allocates nutrition money to state agencies and to certain Native American tribes. The funds are to be used to provide healthy foods to low-income pregnant and nursing mothers and to infants and young children who are at risk for medical problems. So these are important programs that are supported by our legislature to help prevent challenges, health challenges, or developmental challenges in our children. Then we also have Medicaid and the Children's Health Insurance Program. It provides medical assistance to low-income families and children with disabilities. All right, so a lot of information in this chapter, lots of facts and legislature. So, as I recommended at the end of each chapter, go back to those objectives, revisit them, and see what new information you have learned. Thinking about the metaphor of those coat hooks in your head. Hopefully we have lots of scarves and jackets and belts and everything else hung on those, as we've added more information to what we previously thought about. So, after reading this chapter, you should be able to discuss how the early intervention and civil rights movement set the stage for current legislation and individuals with disabilities. 2, explain the impact of landmark legislation for people with disabilities. 3, identify the components of NCLB, including recent changes made. 4, highlight the landmark case law for the inclusion of all children. 5, provide an overview of the public policy in gifted children. And finally, describe 3 pieces of legislation designed to prevent developmental disabilities in children. So take a moment. Hopefully you're able to elaborate a bit more on what you originally knew. If not, it's okay. Go back, review the chapter, and monitor your understanding. And thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.